The Battle of Buna, Gona was part of the New Guinea campaign in the Pacific Theatre during World War II. It followed the conclusion of the Kokoda Track campaign and lasted from the 16th of November 1942 until the 22nd of January 1943. The battle was conducted by Australian and United States forces against the Japanese beachheads at Buna, Sanananda and Gona. From these, the Japanese had launched an overland attack on Port Moresby. In light of developments in the Solomon Islands campaign, Japanese forces approaching Port Moresby were ordered to withdraw to and secure these bases on the northern coast. Australian forces maintained contact as the Japanese conducted a well-ordered rearguard action. The Allied objective was to eject the Japanese forces from these positions and deny them their further use. The Japanese forces were skillful, well-prepared and resolute in their defense. They had developed a strong network of well-concealed defenses. Operations in New Guinea were severely impacted by terrain, vegetation, climate, disease and the lack of infrastructure. In turn, these imposed significant logistical limitations. During the Kokoda Track campaign, these factors applied more or less equally to both belligerents but favored the defender in attacks against well-fortified positions. The battlefield and logistical constraints limited the applicability of conventional Allied doctrine of maneuver and firepower. During the opening stages of the offensive, the Allies faced a severe shortage of food and ammunition. This problem was never entirely resolved. The battle also exposed critical problems with the suitability and performance of Allied equipment. The combat effectiveness of U.S. forces, particularly the U.S. 32nd Division, has been severely criticized. These factors were compounded by repeated demands from General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific area, for a rapid conclusion to the battle. The demands were more to politically secure and strengthen the position of MacArthur's command than for any strategic need. In consequence, troops were hastily committed to battle on repeated occasions, increasing Allied losses and ultimately lengthening the duration of the battle. Allied air power interrupted the Japanese capacity to reinforce and resupply the beachheads from Rabaul. This ultimately made the Japanese position untenable. There was widespread evidence of the Japanese defenders cannibalizing the dead. In the closing stages of the battle, significant numbers of the defenders were withdrawn by sea or escaped overland toward the west and the Japanese base around Salamaua and Lae. The remaining garrison fought to the death, almost to the man. The battle is noteworthy for a number of reasons. The resolve and tenacity of the Japanese in defense was unprecedented and had not previously been encountered. It was to mark the desperate nature of fighting that characterized battles for the remainder of the Pacific War. For the Allies, there were a number of valuable but costly lessons in the conduct of jungle warfare. Allied losses in the battle were at a rate higher than that experienced at Guadalcanal. Background: Japan's entry into World War II and the war in the Pacific commenced with the attack on Pearl Harbor on 7 December 1941, which was coordinated with closely coinciding attacks on Thailand, the Philippines, the American bases on Guam and Wake Island, and the British possessions of Malaya, Singapore, and Hong Kong. Japanese forces rapidly secured territory in Southeast Asia, the East Indies, and the Central and Southwest Pacific. Australia had been shocked by the speedy collapse of British Malaya and the fall of Singapore. With the fall, nearly 15,000 Australian soldiers became prisoners of war along with the rest of the garrison of some 85,000. U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt ordered General Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines to formulate a Pacific defense plan with Australia in March 1942. The Australian Prime Minister, John Curtin, agreed to place Australian forces under the command of MacArthur, who became Supreme Commander, Southwest Pacific Area. MacArthur moved his headquarters to Melbourne in March 1942. The Japanese assaulted Rabaul on 23 January 1942. Rabaul became the forward base for the Japanese campaigns in mainland New Guinea. Japanese forces first landed on the mainland of New Guinea on 8 March 1942 when they invaded Lae and Salamaua to secure bases for the defense of the important base they were developing at Rabaul. The Japanese 17th Army under Lieutenant General Hirokichi Hyakutake was a course-sized command involved in the New Guinea, Guadalcanal, and Solomon Islands campaigns. The Japanese 8th Area Army, under General Hitoshi Imamura, was mobilized to take overall command in the areas from 16 November 1942. It was responsible for both the New Guinea and Solomon Islands campaigns. Imamura was based at Rabaul. The Japanese 18th Army, under Lieutenant General Hitozo Adachi, was also formed to take over responsibilities for Japanese operations on mainland New Guinea, leaving the 17th Army responsible for the Solomon Islands. Despite Australian fears, the Japanese never intended to invade the Australian mainland. While an invasion was considered by the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters in February 1942, it was judged to be beyond the Japanese military's capabilities and no planning or other preparations were undertaken. Instead, in March 1942 the Japanese military adopted a strategy of isolating Australia from the United States, planning to capture Port Moresby in New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands, Fiji, Samoa and New Caledonia. This was frustrated by the Japanese defeat in the Battle of the Coral Sea and postponed indefinitely after the Battle of Midway. The Japanese then planned an overland attack to capture the town by advancing from the north coast. Having already captured much of the northern part of New Guinea earlier that year, they landed on 21 July 1942, to establish beachheads at Buna, Gona and Sanananda. This marked the beginning of the Kokoda Track Campaign. The South Seas Detachment, under command of Major General Tomotarou Hori, advanced using the Kokoda Track to cross the rugged Owen-Stanley Range. As the Kokoda Track Campaign was taking place, a Japanese invasion force made up of Japanese Special Naval Landing Force units attempted to capture the strategic Milne Bay area in August 1942. The Battle of Milne Bay, fought from 25 August to 7 September 1942, resulted in a Japanese defeat. This was the first notable Japanese land defeat and raised Allied morale across the Pacific Theater. Allied forces identified a Japanese airfield under construction at Guadalcanal. 19,000 U.S. Marines were embarked to capture the airfield. An amphibious landing was made on 7 August. The battle lasted until 9 February 1943 and was strongly contested, on land, at sea and in the air. By 16 September, Hori's force had advanced as far as Iribiwa, 32 kilometers from Port Moresby, and was close enough to see the town's lights. In light of reverses at Guadalcanal, Lieutenant General Hirokichi Hyakutake determined he could not support both battles and, on 23 September, ordered Hori to withdraw his troops on the Kokoda Track until the issue at Guadalcanal was decided. Limited provision had been made for the resupply of Hori's force and, by this time, the situation had reached a crisis. There were also concerns that Allied forces might land at Buna at any time. On 26 September, the Japanese commenced to withdraw from the front line. They fought a well-ordered rearguard action back over the Owen-Stanley Range, with the Australian 7th Division in close pursuit. The U.S. 32nd Infantry Division had been sent to New Guinea in September and was ordered to make a circling move against the Japanese eastern flank, near Wairopi. This move commenced on 14 October. These plans were rendered ineffectual by the rate of the Japanese withdrawal, but it did leave the division well positioned to coordinate its advance on the beachheads with the Australians that were approaching from the southwest. Major General Arthur Allen was controversially relieved of command of the 7th Division on 28 October, and replaced by Major General George Vasey, previously commander of the 6th Division. Hori's force had been severely depleted by lack of supply, but at Oivi it received both resupply and reinforcement. The Japanese suffered heavily in the battle around Oivi-Garari, from 4 to the 11th of November, and the well-ordered withdrawal that had been planned quickly disintegrated into a rout. The 7th Division was now about 65 kilometers from Buna, Gona. Although experience demanded caution, the way before them was clear of Japanese forces. Climate and terrain. The Japanese beachheads from which the Kokoda campaign was launched were located about 3 key positions along a 25-kilometer stretch of the north coast of New Guinea. Gona to the west, Buna to the east, and Sanananda-Juruwa in the center. Roughly 160 kilometers northeast of Port Moresby, it approximates to the most direct line from there to the north coast. The settlements are located on a thin coastal strip that separates the sea from a tidal forest swamp of mangroves, Nipper and Sago, rivers flowing across the broad, flat coastal plain from the Owen Stanley Range disappear into the swamps and discharge to the sea through many coastal creeks. The coastal strip is rarely more than a few hundred meters at its widest to little more than a footpad separating the swamp from the sea. The few paths through the swamp were seldom more than 12 foot wide and often narrower. The area was low-lying and featureless. Buna airstrip is 5 feet above sea level. The elevation is only double this at Soputa, 7.5 miles inland, and 85 meters at Popondetta, 21 kilometers inland. The water table is reportedly shallow at about 3 feet. This impacted upon the construction of weapons pits and defensive positions. Areas not waterlogged were either dense jungle or swathes of kunai grass. Coconut plantations filled the wider areas of dry ground along the coastal strip, but neglected undergrowth had reclaimed the ground. The dense kunai grass could grow to 2 meters and the leaves were broad and sharp. Temperatures over the period of the battle ranged from an average daily low of 72 degrees Fahrenheit to 89 degrees Fahrenheit, but with a humidity of 82%. This could be oppressive. In the humid conditions, kunai grass trapped the heat and it was not uncommon for temperatures to reach 50 degrees Celsius. The battle was conducted during the tropical wet season. Average rainfall for December was 368 millimeters, although this figure does not lend itself to a full appreciation of the impact of rain. It was characterized by heavy tropical storms, usually in the afternoon. While the worst of the monsoon held off until after the battle, rain was nonetheless a prevalent feature of the battle. Lieutenant General Robert L. Eichelberger wrote, "At Buna that year it rained about 170 inches, 4,300 millimeters. I have found out since that we got more than our share in December and January. 1942-43, daily rainfall totals of 200 to 250 millimeters were not uncommon. Under these conditions, the few tracks, seldom more than foot trails, quickly became boggy." Disease. Australian, American and Japanese forces had entered one of the most malarial regions in the world. While malaria was the greatest disease threat, other tropical diseases such as dengue fever, scrub typhus, tropical ulcers, dysentery from a range of causes and fungal infections were also common. The impact and susceptibility to disease was exacerbated by poor and insufficient diet. While the Australian Army had encountered malaria in the Middle East, few doctors with the militia had seen the disease before. Supplies of quinine, which was still the major drug in use, were unreliable. Attribution only became the official suppressive drug used by the Australian forces in late December 1942, and the change to its use was not immediate. The need for a strict anti-malaria program was not fully understood. Many officers saw this as a medical rather than a disciplinary issue, and did not compel their men to take their medicine. It was common for Australian soldiers to wear shorts and rolled sleeves in response to the oppressive heat. Mosquito nets and repellent were in short supply, while the repellent that was supplied was considered ineffective. Burgerud states that 85 to 95% of all Allied soldiers in the area carried malaria during the course of the battle. There were 4.8 men hospitalized through sickness for every one Allied battle casualty. 75% of the cases were attributed to malaria. After he had relieved Harding, Eichelberger gave orders to take the temperature of an entire company near the front. Every member of that company was running a fever. By necessity, many men remained in the front lines with a fever as high as 40 degrees Celsius.